The year was 1991, and poverty clung to their small house in Masbate Province, like humidity to skin. 15-year-old Anya had grown accustomed to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the way her school uniform hung loose on her thin frame, and the sound of her father's labored breathing from the bedroom where he lay dying by degrees. Their mother bent over wash basins from dawn until dusk, her hands raw and cracked from soap and hot water, earning just enough to keep them fed and to buy her husband's medicine. But the medicine wasn't working anymore, and everyone in the house could feel death circling like a patient vulture, waiting for its moment to strike. Anya had perfected the art of survival through charm and wit. Each morning, she would walk the dusty road to school with no money in her pockets, no food in her bag, only the desperate creativity that hunger breeds. She made her classmates laugh with jokes and stories, carefully cultivating friendships with those whose families had more than rice and salt for dinner. "I'm starving," she would say with exaggerated drama, clutching her stomach while her friends giggled. "I think I might fade away like a ghost." The strategy worked. Bert would share his sandwich on Monday. Nick would offer his extra rice on Tuesday. And by Friday, Armando might slip her some of his mother's homemade sticky rice sweets. It was a delicate dance of pride and necessity, performed with the skill of someone who had no choice but to master it. Her older siblings had their own methods of keeping hunger at bay. Her brother would sell water and snacks after school, returning home with small bills clutched in his sweaty palm. Her sister found ways to stretch every peso their mother earned, making meals from scraps that somehow satisfied more than they should have. But it was the nights that tested them most. When darkness fell over their small house, and their father's breathing became more irregular, the weight of their situation pressed down like a physical presence. Sometimes Anya would catch her father crying silently as they prepared to leave for school, his tears reflecting the guilt of a man who couldn't provide for his children when they needed him most. "I should be working for you," he would whisper to the empty room, his voice barely carrying across the thin walls. "I should be the one carrying this burden." Their house sat on borrowed land, a constant reminder that even this meager shelter wasn't truly theirs. The walls were thin sheets of corrugated metal that amplified every sound from outside. Dogs barking, neighbors arguing, the occasional rumble of a public minibus navigating the rough roads. But on this particular night, the sounds that reached them were different. The dogs began howling just after midnight, their voices joining in a chorus that seemed to emanate from every corner of the neighborhood. It wasn't the casual barking of animals responding to strangers or territorial disputes. This was something primal and desperate, the kind of sound that raises the hair on human arms and sends ancient warnings racing through the bloodstream. Anya woke to the unsettling harmony, her body instantly alert despite the late hour. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father's breathing becoming more labored, interspersed with small sounds of distress that made her chest tighten with worry. "Tay, what's wrong?" Her brother's voice cut through the darkness as they gathered in their parents' small bedroom. Their father's eyes were wide and unfocused, his skin pale and clammy in the dim light from their single kerosene lamp. "Nothing hurts," he whispered, "but something feels wrong, very wrong." The old man's words hung in the air like smoke, mixing with the continuing howls from outside. This wasn't the first time their father had complained of vague malaise. But tonight felt different. The very atmosphere seemed charged with malevolence, as if something invisible was pressing against their fragile home, testing the barriers between the world of the living and something far more sinister. Their mother suggested they check outside, But when the three siblings peered through gaps in their makeshift curtains, the street appeared normal, empty, quiet, except for the agitated animals, but showing no obvious signs of whatever was causing the disturbance. That's when Anya's brother mentioned hearing footsteps near the kitchen window before they had gathered in their parents' room. The kitchen window faced the narrow space between their house and their neighbor's property, a shadowy corridor where moonlight struggled to penetrate. Anya moved toward it without hesitation, her mind still focused on practical explanations. Perhaps a drunk had wandered into their yard, or maybe some neighborhood children were playing pranks in the darkness. She carried a small kerosene lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls as she approached the window. The smell of burning oil mixed with the humid night air, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Outside, the dogs continued their mournful chorus, their voices now seeming to come from farther away, as if they were retreating from something that approached. When she pushed the window open, just enough to peer outside, the sight that greeted her defied every rational explanation her 15-year-old mind could produce. Standing directly in the path of her lamp's yellow glow was an elderly woman, with wild, unkempt hair that hung like gray seaweed around a face that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. The woman's eyes fixed on Anya's with an intensity that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and strike directly at something deeper, more primitive. In that moment, the girl felt her sense of self begin to dissolve, as if the creature outside was drawing her consciousness out through her eyes, leaving her body empty and vulnerable. Time seemed to stretch and distort. Anya found herself unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare into those ancient, malevolent eyes. The kerosene lamp slipped from her nerveless fingers, its metal body clanging against the concrete floor as the glass globe shattered into pieces. The sound should have broken her trance, but instead she watched with detached fascination as burning oil spread across the floor, the flames licking hungrily at the wooden walls. The acrid smell of smoke began to fill the small kitchen. But still she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even feel fear about the fire that was growing larger by the second. "Why does it smell like gas?" Her brother's voice seemed to come from very far away. Though he was only in the next room, he found her standing motionless at the window, flames spreading behind her like a hellish halo, her eyes vacant and staring at something outside that he couldn't see. When he followed her gaze, the space beyond the window was empty, showing nothing but shadows and the distant glow of a neighbor's security light. "Anya, Anya." Her sister's sharp slap across her face finally shattered whatever hold the entity had on her consciousness. The world came rushing back in a flood of sensation. The heat from the spreading fire, the acrid smoke burning her lungs, the sound of her brother frantically beating at the flames with wet rags. Panic seized her as she realized how close they had come to losing their entire house, their only shelter in a world that offered them so few options. Her mother's scolding cut through the chaos like a blade. "Do you realize what could have happened? We have nothing, and you almost burned down what little we do have." But Anya could barely process the words. Her body shook uncontrollably as the memory of those eyes returned, bringing with it the terrifying knowledge that whatever had stood outside their window was not human, suggested something far more dangerous than any ordinary intruder. Hours passed before she could speak coherently about what she had seen. When she finally described the elderly woman with the wild hair, her brother grabbed a machete knife and circled their entire property, searching for any sign of the intruder. But the dogs had fallen silent, and the night seemed to have returned to normal, as if nothing had ever disturbed its peace. Their mother, drawing on folklore passed down from her own grandmother, instructed him to circle the house 7 times. If you encounter her, shout for us. We'll surround the creature and drive it away." But 7 complete circuits revealed nothing. And gradually the family began to settle back into uneasy rest. Yet as the hours passed, they noticed their father growing visibly weaker, his breathing becoming more shallow and labored with each passing moment. It was as if the night's supernatural visitor had somehow accelerated whatever illness was consuming him from within. By dawn, the change in his condition was undeniable. When he tried to speak, only air and whispered fragments emerged, his words dissolving before they could form meaning. The family gathered around his bed, recognizing the signs they had been dreading for months. At 3 a.m, the animal chorus began again. This time, not just the neighborhood dogs, but cats as well, their eyes reflecting pinpricks of light as they stared fixedly at the corrugated metal roof above the dying man's bed. The family pets, usually calm and affectionate, now crouched with their fur standing on end, their bodies rigid with tension as they tracked something invisible moving overhead. "Shh, come here," their mother whispered to the cats, but they refused to acknowledge her voice, their attention locked on whatever presence moved above them in the darkness. The scratching began slowly, tentatively, like fingernails testing the strength of the metal roofing. But as minutes passed, the sound grew more aggressive, more purposeful. The creature above them was methodically working to create an opening, and the scratching was centered directly over their father's bed, as if it could sense the location of the weakest soul in the house. Without hesitation, Anya's brother climbed onto the bed and began driving his machete knife through the roof where the scratching was loudest. The metal bent and punctured under his desperate attacks, and what happened next confirmed their worst fears. A sound emerged from above that was neither human nor animal, but something caught between the two. It was a howl of pain and rage that seemed to come from a throat not designed for such vocalizations. A sound that spoke of ancient hungers and predatory intelligence. "Keep suffering, you creature. That's what you deserve," he shouted, driving the blade again and again through the roof. When he finally climbed down, the knife's edge was slick with thick, dark blood that gleamed in the lamplight. The scratching had stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps moving across their roof toward the back of the house, the metal sheeting creaking and bending under significant weight. But even wounded, the creature wasn't finished with them. The footsteps accelerated into a run, and the entire roof shook as if something large was fleeing toward the rear of their property. Anya's brother couldn't contain himself any longer. He burst out the back door, knife raised, challenging whatever lurked in the darkness. "Show yourself, coward. Face me if you want what's in this house." But the backyard was empty, showing no sign of the creature except for the sound of retreating footsteps disappearing into the distance. When he returned, defeated and angry, he reported hearing movement heading away from their home, as if their resistance had finally driven the thing off. At 4 a.m, their father died. The family's grief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a terrible understanding of what they had witnessed. The creature hadn't been some random supernatural encounter. It had come specifically for their father, drawn perhaps by his approaching death, seeking to claim something from his departing soul. For the next 2 days, as they prepared for the funeral, their home remained quiet. But on the final night before the burial, as friends and neighbors gathered for the traditional vigil, the supernatural attention returned with renewed intensity. An elderly woman appeared among the mourners, her face marked with fresh wounds that looked suspiciously like knife cuts. She approached their father's casket without speaking, stared down at his peaceful face for several long moments, then departed as mysteriously as she had arrived. None of the other mourners recognized her. When questioned, neighbors could offer no explanation for who she might have been or how she had learned of the death. At 11 o'clock that night, the familiar sound of howling dogs filled the air once again. But this time, the family was surrounded by dozens of community members, all keeping vigil through the night. They felt protected by numbers, confident that whatever had terrorized them before couldn't approach with so many witnesses present. Then came the sound they had hoped never to hear again. Tick, vampiric creature tick. The distinctive call echoed from the darkness beyond their yard, the sound that local folklore associated with the most dangerous of all supernatural predators. "We need to take action," one of the elderly mourners advised. "It wants to take the body. If we don't show strength, it will succeed." But just as everyone had armed themselves and prepared for confrontation, the ticking stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard something far more terrifying, the sound of enormous wings beating against the night air, coming from the large tree behind their house. The sound was unlike any bird they knew. The wing beats were too large, too powerful, suggesting something with a wingspan that defied natural explanation. As the creature took flight, several mourners caught glimpses of it, silhouetted against the stars, a shape with leathery wings like a bat, but far larger than any earthly creature should be. The village in Antique had always been a place where shadows lingered longer than they should. In 1995, when the young security guard first arrived at his pregnant sister's home, he thought the mountain air would bring him peace. He was wrong. His sister lived with her husband, Roger, in a house surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the sun even at midday. Years later, all three children became medical professionals, driven by their mother's tearful words that night, "If only we had money to treat your father properly." But sometimes, late at night, Anya still finds herself listening for the sound of scratching on metal roofs, wondering if somewhere in the darkness, creatures with ancient hungers still circle the homes of the dying, waiting for their moment to claim what they believe belongs to them.